guess I don't want you to follow me up. We normally have a chair, so why don't we have you sit over here and I'll call you up. How's that? Yeah, I think that makes the most sense. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to this Harvard Kennedy School commencement speech, and with our quite remarkable speaker, David Miliband. I promised you a hot afternoon, and we have it today. This is part of a very exciting week, and where we will be graduating roughly 670 students, as well as being inspired in a variety of ways. Tomorrow, those of you who are graduating will receive your diplomas in this very place. Today, we gather for inspiration and for a chance to draw meaning from this year's commencement speaker. It is my very great honor to welcome today the Right Honorable David Miliband. He is a dedicated public leader whose commitment to both public policy ideas and the application is really quite inspirational. His career in elective and appointed government offices, focusing on both domestic and international issues, and now leading an NGO with global reach on the front lines of today's crisis, has been remarkable. He is indeed what we all talk about when we say we aspire to be public leaders. Leaders who care about something larger than themselves and who provide a vision as well as the capacity to make real change happen. His dedication exemplifies much of what we aspire to as well. Both of Miliband's parents were refugees who experienced huge trauma during their early lives as they escaped continental Europe ahead of the Holocaust. His father, Ralph, was 16 when he fled Belgium in 1940. His mother, Marion, fled Poland at the age of 10. And when Miliband took his job at the International Rescue Committee, which was founded by Albert Einstein in 1933 to help refugees from Nazi Germany, he talked of closing the circle with the past, by helping modern-day refugees. He says he feels compelled to repay his debt to society for the privileges he enjoyed. He is quoted as saying, "My generation is a transitional generation because we met people who survived the Holocaust and who have a responsibility to pass on what happened to a new generation." Family has indeed always been important to him. He tells people his proudest achievement since moving to the U.S. is that when not traveling or needed on a morning television show, he walks his two sons the 1.25 miles to their primary school home from their family's home, even through this recent frigid winter. I'm actually quite curious to know, is this just like talk, or did you actually walk in this winter? It was quite something. As I mentioned, today, Miliband is the president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee. He oversees the agency's relief and development operations in over 40 countries and its refugee resettlement and assistance programs throughout the United States. In addition, he leads the IRC's advocacy efforts in Washington, Geneva, Brussels, and other capitals on behalf of the world's most vulnerable people. The organization now is a size of greater than $600 million per year. He's also had, as all of you know, a quite distinguished political career in the UK. From 2007 to 2010, he served as the youngest UK Foreign Secretary in 3 decades, driving advancements in human rights and representing the United Kingdom throughout the world. During this time, then US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton referred to him as vibrant, vital, attractive, and smart. We are not going to really go into that in great detail. As Secretary of State for Environment, he pioneered the world's first legally binding emissions reduction requirements. His accomplishments have earned him a reputation in former Bill Clinton's words as one of the ablest, most creative public servants of our time, as an effective and passionate advocate for the world's uprooted and poor children. He was earlier Minister for Communities and Local Governments, Minister for Schools, head of the No. 10 Policy Unit, and a member of Parliament representing South Shields. He was raised in an academic environment. His father, Ralph, was a very well-known thinker on a variety of leftist issues. And while his political values sometimes differ from those of his father, he graduated from Oxford University in 1987 with a first-class degree in philosophy, politics, and economics. He was seen as intellectually confident and sure of his opinions, something that is very atypical. Those of us at Harvard are never intellectually confident or sure of our opinions. University contemporaries remember him working on his essays in the college bar with a pint of orange juice and a Mars bar. We chose not to have a Mars bar today because it would melt. After working with the center-left think tank, he worked his way up in Tony Blair's government and so forth. He also received a master's degree in political science in 1989 from MIT as, interestingly enough, a Kennedy scholar. He has visited the Kennedy School in recent years and has taught, he was named a Fisher Family Fellow and has taught in connection with our Future of Diplomacy project. Now at the IRC, he heads an organization that together with its partners helps victims of war, diseases, including Ebola, and persecution around the globe and here in the United States. As one example, they have been one of the largest providers of aid in South Sudan since 1989. And during the current crisis, the IRC has provided 800,000 people with health care, water, sanitation, and the like. Whether it's the Congo or Syria, wherever there's a crisis around the world and people in conflict need help, the IRC has been in the lead. Indeed, in 2014 alone, they helped 17.6 million people whose lives and livelihoods were shattered by conflict. It is my very great honor to welcome to the Kennedy School today's commencement speaker, the Right Honorable David Miliband.
Thank you very much, Dean Elwood, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, professors, students, families. I want to start by saying it is a truly great honor for me to have been invited to speak to you today. I really want to offer very warm congratulations to the graduating class. I know from friends who've graduated from the Kennedy School and from my own teaching here when I was a Fisher Fellow in 2012 that the standards are high, that the values of public service are enduring, and that the ambitions for global impact of this school are wholly in keeping with the legacy of John F. Kennedy. I also know it's very, very tough to get in. But once you do make it here, the sense of collegiality and teamwork is really very striking indeed. And I want to remark also on the fantastic diversity of the student population, international diversity, that is inspiring in its breadth and in its depth. But I also want to say this, that while your origins are diverse, the commitment to provide practical answers to advance the social good is really inspiring. So individually and collectively, you have my real admiration. I also want to take 30 seconds just to thank the unsung heroes of this occasion, who are the families of those of you who are graduating tomorrow. You're the quiet heroes of the student experience, all the bills and none of the fun, as I was once told. But certainly from my own experience, I know students can't make it without the support of their families, and I think it's important to recognize that. And I also think it's worth pausing to recognize that there would be no class at all without outstanding teachers. And while it's invidious to pick out a single person, I think it's right to recognize that after 11 very successful years as an inspiring, caring, and inquiring dean, David Elwood deserves your special thanks and appreciation. I also want to strike a personal note. It's always special for me to come back to Cambridge, Massachusetts, because in the 1970s, as a 12-year-old schoolboy, I came to live in Newton, Massachusetts, just next door. That's the town next door. I attended junior high school. I played the role of Mayor Slade in the musical Destry Rides Again. It was a musical in which I was banned from either singing or dancing. So my contribution was limited, but I did play the role of the mayor. And in that year of 1977-78, there began a 40-year relationship between me and the United States, and especially the East Coast of the United States. In later years, I went to graduate school here, as David has said. My wife is a dual UK-US citizen. My kids were born in the US, and we all now live and work in New York. But as David has mentioned, I have a confession to make, which is that although I was presented with the choice of studying at the Kennedy School, I decided not to do so. I chose instead to fulfill my Kennedy Scholarship down the road at MIT. And I'm sure that this wasn't my greatest foolishness, but it could count as one of my early ones. Whenever I come back to the school, it's a reminder of a road not taken. Just imagine if I'd been able to take the course that was on offer to my housemates in 1988-89, which may well still be on offer today. It was called then How to Be a Politician. I might have saved myself a lot of trouble if I'd taken that course. Because I joined the Labour Party in the UK 30 years ago. That makes me feel old. I was a member of Parliament for 12 years from 2001. I was proud to be a minister for 8 years in a Labour government in the UK, including 3 years as Foreign Secretary. And people sometimes say to me, often say to me, well, how did it happen? What made it happen? And the truth is that my big break owed a lot to luck. I was in the back room in the early 1990s when Labour in Britain figured out how to win elections rather than lose them. As this month's election in the UK showed, the electorate have recently sent us back to the classroom for the second time in 5 years. Today, I'm very proud indeed to be running the International Rescue Committee, which, as David says, has 16,000 staff in 35 to 40 countries around the world, as well as in 22 offices around the US, resettling new refugees here. And I can reflect on what you've been studying on government and on politics from the outside rather than from the inside. And that's what I want to do this afternoon. My first political opinions were developed in the 1980s in reaction to the politics of Margaret Thatcher in the UK. After university, I graduated in 1987. The collapse of communism turned international politics upside down. And then in the 1990s in the UK, but also in the US, in continental Europe, in Australia, in South America, center-left politics was rebuilt as an effective fighting force after a lost decade in the 1980s. What drove that success? What underpinned it? I would say 5 things. First, understanding the difference between knowing your own mind and asserting your own version of reality. The former, knowing your own mind, is essential. The latter, defining your own reality, is dangerous. The best politicians recognize the facts and then apply their values rather than making the facts fit the reality they've organized in advance. Second, recognizing the importance of tackling fundamental problems rather than evading them. President Eisenhower's advice, I think, still holds. When you cannot solve a problem, enlarge it. In all the talk of the management books, and maybe even at the Kennedy School, of quick wins and low-hanging fruit, what's important can get lost. But the top politicians never confuse tactical froth with strategic choices. Third, I learned the importance of embracing the reality that ideas really matter in politics. Argument, not arithmetic, is what counts. If there is a Bush-Clinton rematch in the US next year, the decisive issue will be which one of them has the biggest ideas for the future of the country, because something always beats nothing. Fourth, spotting that so much which seems important to the media at any one time is actually not so. Far more important than what's in the headlines is often the decisions not taken. Not taken in order to avoid controversy in the short term, but at the risk of allowing problems to fester in the long term. And then fifth and finally, perhaps most important, learning, as I hope you have at this school, that government can be a great force for good, but it requires a cast of mind that I would describe as entrepreneurial. That is the role of politics, to add entrepreneurship to necessary bureaucracy. Its role is to create the space for innovation, and that means constantly being alive to the need and the importance of reinventing what government does and how it does it. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. The vital importance for all of us, whichever country we're returning to after studying here, the vital importance of reinventing what we do in humanitarian affairs and in foreign policy. Now, you've probably all realized, or your parents have, that by choosing this school, you didn't set yourselves up for the most lucrative careers that are available. After all, you did not choose the law school or the business school. Don't your parents know it, probably? But the imperative that you have embraced to understand how to solve complex problems of public policy is, to me, incredibly important. Your mission, and these words can risk naivety, is to commit yourselves to make the world a better place, to make a difference as the school enjoins you. Now, I don't regard that impulse as naive, and I certainly don't regard it as anything other than necessary. Right now, as you survey the world that you're going to go into, there are plenty of domestic policy challenges that you can get your teeth into. Stagnant middle-class wages, pension liabilities, youth unemployment from Egypt to South Africa to France. And these are major questions, and everywhere the debate is vigorous and there are solutions being canvassed. But what I want to put to you today is the same cannot be said of foreign policy. There is not the same energy or imagination going into foreign policy solutions as there is in domestic policy. As President Obama said in the middle of last year, switch on the news and you would think the world is going to hell. Now that the world, though, is a global village, the question we confront in foreign policy is actually the same as the question we face in domestic policy. How we can live, as Keynes said, quote, not just wisely and agreeably, but also well. Wisely, so that we sustain the nourishment of the planet for future generations. Agreeably, so that human difference is a source of wonder, not enmity. And well, so that the fruits of progress are properly shared. And for that, we need the same degree of entrepreneurialism, idealism, passion, energy that's there in domestic policy. It's really extraordinary, if you think about it, that the world's population has never been healthier, wealthier, better educated, better connected. But at the same time, the number of people displaced by conflict and disaster has never been higher. The number of states around the world prey to chaotic violence. Oh, that's good. Is that someone asked for the motor to be switched off next door? That's... Can everyone hear? I promise you I won't start again and go through it all again. But the number of people displaced by conflict and disaster is at record highs, while actually the sources of democracy and hope, in a way, certainly of economic advancement, have never been greater. States prey to chaotic violence. An international system that is weaker and more divided than for a generation demand our attention. But what's actually happening in politics around the world? What's actually happening is that the traditionally strong international powers, notably in Western countries, are reining themselves in. In the US, to be honest, the danger is that the priority of nation building at home becomes a recipe for neglect of engagement abroad. And in the UK, my own country, We're one of the most open and globally engaged cultures in the world. Our aid department, the Department for International Development, is a world leader, but politically, we're in retreat. The defense budget's going down. There's a referendum on whether or not we should even stay in the European Union. And meanwhile, outside the Western world, the emerging powers are leery about engaging in politics beyond their own region. And what's the result? In my judgment, the result is a vacuum in the global commons. Trade deals are stalled, the environment is under assault, new wars are starting as old wars refuse to fade. And the most vivid, the most distressing, and the most dangerous example of what I mean is in Syria today. And there are some students from Jordan and Turkey and Lebanon and Iraq at this school. There may even be students from Syria. Syria is where all the problems and the absence of solutions of modern foreign policy come together. So much so that the human consequences are losing their capacity to shock. And the best leading indicator of that is that what's going on in Syria is no longer considered newsworthy. The really shocking aspect of what's happening in Syria is the extraordinary absence of a political process to seek to solve the problem, or even impetus towards a political process. Instead, amid desperate and declining and dangerous silence, Syria is declining into a version of hell, and its problems are being exported to its neighbors. I just want to recap for you the scale of the disaster that is unfolding in an absolutely critical part of the world. It's not an exaggeration to say it's a disaster of biblical proportions, perhaps an especially apposite thing to say, given its focus on Syria. Since March 2001, that's just 4 years ago, the conflict has claimed 260,000 lives at least. Some estimates put it at twice that. Every second Syrian is in need of humanitarian help out of a population of 22 million. There are 3 million children inside and outside the country who've been robbed of their future because there's no school for them to go to. Inside the country, the humanitarian disaster is not an unfortunate byproduct of conflict. It's the intended result of a strategy being pursued by the government of Syria to win its war. The bombs of the government of Syria last week killed 7 of the people being served by us in Idlib city. The water and electrical supplies of more than 2 million people in Aleppo and Daraa were willfully disrupted by warring parties in February. More than half of the hospitals of the country have been damaged or destroyed. This is a middle-class country that we're talking about. The aid on offer is not keeping pace with the scale of the problem. Water, food, shelter, healthcare, sanitation, hygiene services, all desperately needed. And the UN aid appeal for 2015 is 19% filled 5 months into the calendar year. And of course, the conflict is not being contained within the borders of Syria. The burden on the neighbors is huge. Turkey has become the largest refugee hosting country in the world. 1 in 4 of the population of Lebanon is now a Syrian. The 3rd largest city in Jordan is a refugee camp. And I would put it to you that while some things are complicated, and you can understand why they're not being done, others are relatively simple. And when they're not done, it's closer to a crime than a tragedy. We know that over 300,000 Syrian children in Lebanon are getting no education at all. We know also that Western countries have been extraordinarily reluctant to admit the most vulnerable Syrians as refugees. The US figure is actually remarkable because the US has historically been a world leader in refugee resettlement, taking about 75,000 people a year. For the last 4 years, the sum total of Syrians who've been admitted to the United States is 842. The figures for most European countries are similar. Germany, to be fair, has committed to resettle 30,000. Now, if I'd stood here 4 years ago and said that I predicted there would be 12 million in humanitarian need, 4 million refugees, 260,000 dead, and that the international peace effort that was consistent with that scale of suffering was 1 UN envoy seeking a temporary ceasefire in 1 Syrian city, I don't think you would have accepted that. But that's actually what's happening today. and leave to one side that Iraq, which has caught the contagion, deserves a lecture all of its own. I would put it to you that over the last 4 years, we have proved the risks, not of doing too much, but of doing too little. We've shown in the terrible unfolding that not to take action is an action of consequence every bit as grave as intervention itself. In fact, many of the real dangers of Western engagement, a refugee crisis, the use of chemical weapons, the incitement of extremism, have happened anyway. And the reasons for this, I think, are sadly clear. The diplomatic determination, imagination, energy that's required to end the war has ebbed, and today, left to one UN envoy, all but disappeared. You can find the excuses: deteriorating relations between the US and Russia over Ukraine, the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, rifts between the backers of the different Syrian opposition groups, and of course, the very high price of the mistakes of the West in Iraq and Afghanistan, which have sapped the confidence that Western powers will do anything other than make things worse, and drain support for anything other than hand-wringing. That is the explanation for the UK's almost total absence from the political as well as the military battlefield. Syria's descent into hell therefore raises, I would argue, very hard questions for the humanitarian sector that is now in the front line and for foreign policy. And I just want to touch on both. Let me just start with the humanitarian response, which is at the same time essential, but also partial. In 2013, for the first time since World War II, the number of refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced people exceeded 50 million. That was one refugee every 5 seconds. More than half of the displaced people are now in urban areas, about a quarter in refugee camps. Conflicts and complex emergencies like Syria, but also Somalia, Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, now Yemen, account for about 3/4 of these crises. And this sector, the humanitarian sector, delivers about $22 billion of aid a year to people affected. But the gap between how much is needed and how much is given is growing, not shrinking. And here's the mismatch as well, because it's not just about the amount of money. The humanitarian sector is designed to address the victims of wars between states. Yet more and more, we're dealing with those affected by wars within states, i.e. civil wars, 33 of them in 2013. The sector is designed around the responsibilities of nations, yet more and more we're working where conflict involves non-state actors. The sector is designed around a model of service provision based on refugee camps, yet 3/4 of those displaced are not in camps. And this displaced population is increasingly young, female, and displaced for a very long time. The average refugee is out of their own country for about 20 years. That means there's a whole new agenda for the humanitarian sector of which the IRC is a part. For donors to become much clearer about the outcomes that they're seeking, for the evidence base of what works to be radically improved, for interventions like cash distribution rather than the provision of goods and services to be embraced, because that's the way of giving power to the people who are actually affected by these crises, and for a new compact between displaced people and the communities they arrive in and the international community about the economic and social support for peoples and nations bearing the burden of refugee flows. I don't know how many people here have followed the crisis in the Mediterranean off southern Europe, but that speaks to a complete imbalance of responsibility both between the European nations and further afield. But even if we double the scale and the effectiveness of the humanitarian effort, it will never be enough, because it's only ever clearing up the debris once something is broken. By definition, it's crisis management. And so we have to look, it's incumbent on us to look at global politics for solutions as well. I'm sure some of you here studied that in 2005, the world came together to assert something called the responsibility to protect. Over 190 nations signed up to the doctrine that rulers had obligations to their peoples, and if the covenant was broken, then the international community had a responsibility to fulfill those obligations to the civilians concerned. This was in the context of the Rwandan genocide. Over 50 million people today need that responsibility to be reasserted, the norms and laws of war to be reaffirmed, the rights of women and girls to be free of abuse, to be affirmed as universal, not Western values, and the tools to underpin these rights and norms need to be sharpened. And I want to use this occasion to mention two very practical things that need to change in international politics, in my view. One concerns the UN Security Council, which has as its mandate the requirement that it consider all matters that are a threat to regional peace and security. I would argue that humanitarian atrocities fall into that category because their impact spills over into neighboring states, never mind because it causes political destabilization. You'll know that in the Syria crisis, Russia and China vetoed 3 Security Council resolutions designed to hold the Syrian government to account for the humanitarian mass atrocities. They were vetoed. And of course, there's history in this. Just to remind you, some of you, apartheid was condemned by the UN General Assembly in 1966 as a crime against humanity. 10 draft resolutions that followed, which sought to impose sanctions, were then vetoed in the UN Security Council after 1966. What's the way around this? I think the French Foreign Minister, Mr. Fabius, has come up with something important and interesting. He's proposed a new code of conduct concerning the use of the UN Security Council veto in situations of genocide, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing. His plan is that each permanent member of the Security Council should suspend their right of veto in cases of mass atrocity. It's an idea that first came up in 2001. Madeleine Albright, William Cohen, former Secretary of State and Defense Secretary in the US, pursued the same thought. And of course, there are issues to be addressed about how you define a mass atrocity. And countries might use their veto anyway, because this is only a voluntary suspension. But that would be to their moral and political cost. A new norm would be established in international politics. And if it did nothing else, it would provide a firmer moral footing for countries that wanted to pursue other forms of intervention. In my time as Foreign Minister, I never used the veto in the Security Council. In fact, the UK hasn't used it since 1989. And so I want today to endorse the French proposal for a voluntary limitation of the veto and call on others to do so as well. It would raise the costs of turning a blind eye and increase the pressure not to do so. The second and final example I want to give concerns UN peacekeeping. Few people know that over 100,000 troops, police, and military experts from 122 countries are undertaking 16 UN missions around the world. Total cost is about $8.5 billion. The bills are played in the main by the West. The US pays about a quarter of the total cost. And the missions are increasingly dangerous, complex, and long. And the results, if I'm honest, are frankly mixed. There are a number of reasons, but one reason is the refusal of the strongest military powers to deploy under UN auspices. In the US, this has legal force since the 1994 presidential directive insisting that all US troops must always be under US command. In the UK, it's the result of inertia. We post less than 300 servicemen and women to UN missions, compared to about 10,000 in 1994. But it's not just the US and the UK. European peacekeepers down to around 6,000. And it's not just about numbers, because what these UN missions need is intelligence, engineers, airlift, bomb disposal, experienced officers and leadership. And so it's very, very important that the signs of a new interest in UN peacekeeping from Ambassador Samantha Power, who spoke here last year, President Obama promising to chair a special session of the Security Council in September, the UN Security Council setting up a review of peacekeeping operations. It's very, very important that those reviews come to something. I would argue that at a time of cuts in defense budgets, new and asymmetric threats, record numbers of people fleeing conflict, the case for strengthened and more fairly shared UN peacekeeping is overwhelming. But what peacekeepers need above all is for the parties to the conflict to see a path to compromise that involves a share of power, not surrender. Civilians need that too. In other words, peacekeeping is only as good as the political vision it serves. And in the UN, that is currently separated into 2 different departments. The peacekeeping review needs to have as its major conclusion a commitment to link the peacekeeping missions of the UN to its political diplomacy. And I can tell you from our own experience in war zones, civilians need both. These ideas about foreign policy can seem abstruse and even academic. Maybe academic is not a swear word in this institution. But I would argue that the debate needs to be broadened out a long way. And I think you, the graduates of this school, have a very important responsibility in this. What I think you've learned here is how to turn passion into practical politics. And sometimes that is dismissed as quote-unquote technocratic. There's nothing wrong with being technocratic, but I would say you should never lose sight of the passion which was the impetus to make a difference in the first place. And I have to tell you that there is a view abroad that your generation, this generation of graduates, is an apathetic generation. Pope Francis has gone as far as to bemoan what he calls the globalization of indifference. Now, I have to tell you, that's not what I see on university campuses in the US, in Pakistan, in the Middle East, where I've spoken in the last year. In the complex, murky, but magnificent world we live in, it's easy to get lost in the detail and forget that what inspired you to join a school of government in the first place was a passionate desire to see a problem alleviated and the world improved. And my message to you today is never forget that. Never lose that sense of passion. Others have done it, in some ways, in much more difficult circumstances than we face today. And we're standing on their moral and institutional shoulders. And I want to give you a very specific example. In 1931, a young man called Varian Fry left this university to work as a foreign correspondent for an American journal called Living Age. It was while he was in Berlin in 1935 that he witnessed the abuse of the Jews in Germany at that time. He wrote fearlessly about this subject for the New York Times. But then he concluded that it wasn't enough to be a commentator about the state of the world. He had a responsibility to do something about it. Varian Fry helped create what became the International Rescue Committee, the organization I now lead. He risked his life to help Jews flee the Vichy regime from Marseille in the south of France. He smuggled more than 2,000 people across the border into neutral Portugal and from there on to safety in the United States. And in a letter to his wife in 1941, he said, "Among the people who've come into my office are not only some of the greatest living authors, painters, and sculptors of Europe, but also former cabinet ministers and even prime ministers of half a dozen countries. What a strange place Europe is when men and women like this are reduced to patiently waiting in the anteroom of a young American of no importance whatsoever." Now, Varian Fry was right on every point except the last one, because he was far from unimportant. In fact, he held the difference for those people between life and death. And he was the man who helped people whose names you will know: Hannah Arendt, André Breton, Marc Chagall, Marcel Duchamp, Golo Mann, Arthur Koestler were all rescued from Europe by Varian Fry, along with 2,000 others whose names, of course, we don't know, but who are of equal and significant importance to this American story. He was a real hero, a man who went out into the world, encountered injustice, and could not rest until he'd put it right. Many years later, he gave an account of what he did and left us with, if you like, a manifesto for a day like this. A manifesto for those of you who want to go out to do good in the world. "I could not remain idle," he said, "as long as I had any chance at all of saving even a few of the intended victims." Ladies and gentlemen, students, families, professors, perhaps we all do not have the heroism of Varian Fry. Certainly not. But something of his spirit lives in all of us. And certainly it resides in the animating spirit of this institution and its founder. It's with that thought in mind that I wish you well as you enter, or for those of you in mid-career, re-enter, the world beyond academe and beyond Cambridge, Massachusetts. A world which in time, I hope, will be that little bit better for your efforts within it. Thank you very much indeed for listening to me today. It's been my privilege to speak to you. Thank you. Thank you.
someday that could be you. Today, we now have a reception outside in another tent right behind us, which will include various goodies or whatever else. But for now, we are dismissed. Thank you very much, and we hope to see most of you tomorrow. Thank you very much.